All right, welcome back, welcome back. So I do want this to be a conversation, so I'll go back and forth between me sharing some things, you sharing at tables, and us interacting as a whole group. So you can feel relieved that you won't just be listening to me talk the rest of the day. We want this to be interactive. And what my goal for you is that you might walk away from today with a bit of a rule of life, if that's a concept that's familiar to you. It comes to us from Benedictine spirituality and Christian history. Saint Benedict and his order of monastic community came up with a set of practices that they would all follow individually and communally that helped them lean into the rhythms of work and rest that we're designed for, of action and contemplation, another way to think about it. And so I want to encourage you to think about some practices that you're already doing and that you might include. So let's talk about daily well-being, since this is the first thing that becomes a concern for pastors. This is where we talk about our quality of daily life, things like our physical well-being, emotional well-being, the impact of stress. Stress, of course, is unavoidable. In fact, a certain amount of stress is actually helpful to us in terms of helping us to do our best and sort of call the best out of us. But it's the chronic stress that becomes the issue. Particularly for ministry leaders, and I'll get more into that. The question we want to talk about in daily well-being is one of dominant tone over time. So again, we're not suggesting a Pollyanna kind of a thing here that once you follow Jesus and become an ordained Nazarene pastor, then it's all sunshine and unicorns and everything's wonderful and you never have any problems or stress. Yes, question? Yeah, you bet. But we're talking about over time, do you more live into what we're calling a sustained positivity? Are you out of the hope of the gospel, good old Wesleyan eschatology? We know where this story ends and how it ends, and we draw hope from that. And is that hope literally sustaining us on a day-by-day basis in such a way that it translates itself into ways that we can encourage ourselves in the Lord, as the Psalms say David did. Are these things more dominant over time? Are you a glass half full kind of person, a glass half empty kind of person? And I was talking to one of my Trevecca roommates, and he was talking about his mom the other day. He said she's a glass half full person. The glass is just half full of something bad. So apparently there's a third option I didn't know about. But are you experiencing these kinds of positive emotions, at least more often than not? Feeling a sense of awe and worship, perhaps, joy, excitement, engagement with life. Again, this is in every moment of every day. But what's the dominant tone over time? If these things become prevalent, dominant, then that's something for us to pay attention to. Now, all of us are going to experience some of these things probably every day, certainly evoked by the work of ministry, if nothing else, if not just by life itself. But if these are the dominant, prevalent thing over a long period of time, that's something for us to pay attention to. And so one of the things we can do to help ourselves is to engage in practices that help us to remember the hope, remember the joy, remember the positive things. We looked at pastoral ministry in this research as an occupation, as a job, which had never been done, to my knowledge, in quite this way before. And I know it's more than a job. It's a calling, it's a life. It's an all family, all finances, all life, all in kind of deal, isn't it? This isn't the half-hearted, you kind of phoned it in kind of commitment. This is a whole life deal. So I don't want to suggest we're reducing it to something that's just a job. That's not what I'm trying to say. What I'm saying is, if you look at the role, it has things in common with other helping professions, but there are also things that are absolutely unique, that are unlike any other job or unlike any other role. For example, Ministry is high-stakes work dealing with ultimate concerns. In other words, what we know from occupational stress research is if you have a kind of job and we attribute spiritual significance to our work, which of course you do, and rightly so, people tend to be all in with their work. The issue typically for pastors is not that we don't love what we do. It's that we love it and we probably do too much of it to be sustainable. And so we need to think about sort of a theology of stewardship of the greatest tool God has given you in ministry, which is you. And how do we steward that well over time? Ministry work is complex. Can I get an amen? I'm going to show you some research on role complexity. I can back up with research, and I'll do it in a bit, that you have the most complex job description that exists. Can I get a stronger amen from that? Yeah. Well played. I was sharing this with a group of researchers, and this really kind of arrogant scientist type dude in the back said, "Are you saying it's more complex than being a rocket scientist?" And I said, "Yes, I am saying that. And let me tell you why. Because a rocket scientist gets to be a specialist. They get to hone in on this one little slice of science and do this one little piece. And frankly, don't have to even do well with people to be able to do that. Pastors have to be expert generalists. There are so many areas of competency it would be nice to be an expert in. The breadth of that is so enormous, and what we call the switching costs, switching rapidly between those in any given day, from pastoral counseling to sermon prep to church budget to fixing the plumbing in the restroom at the church to hospital visits, and that's just Monday, right? Very few jobs require that of a person, so we want to talk about that. It's also continuous work. When are you done? Yes. Yeah. When have you done enough for today? Yeah, you wake up, work is all around you. It's always ongoing. There's always more you could do, sometimes more we feel like we should do, never ending. You don't punch out at 5 o'clock with your time card and then you're done. When are you not a pastor? If you show up at the grocery store at 10 o'clock at night to pick up something and you run into somebody from church in the produce aisle, you're doing pastoral care or hearing a confession or something in the produce aisle. It's just how it works, right? And it's what we call role immersion. It's what psychologists call role immersion. It's you're immersed in this role 24/7. And there are wonderful things about that. There are also some challenging things we have to think about in terms of taking care of ourselves. Ministry work is punctuated by unexpected events. We've talked about that already. Just nature of the role. Just unexpected things are happening all the time. Sometimes there can be little structure or guidance. Depends on the district people are on, and on your particular district, you have leadership that gives clear leadership for these are the kinds of things we're going to emphasize over the next 3 to 5 years or whatever it is in our missional strategy. And many of you think through that at in your own local church context. And so you've thought through where do we need to be spending my time as the leader? Where do we need to be emphasizing investment of resources? But we have to bring that structure to the work, is the point I'm making. And that takes energy emotionally. It's not as if all that's going to be there for us. We have to bring that with us to the work and bring others along with us in that. The impact of digital communication. They tell us there's more technology in our phones than there was in the first lunar lander that took people to the moon, which is kind of shocking to think about. We love these things. They're also kind of are not good for us. You all may be aware that the companies that make smartphones and iPhones hire neuroscientists to design them to be addictive to your brain on purpose because they want you on them all the time because that's how they make more money. And we're seeing skyrocketing rates of depression and anxiety, particularly among adolescents and children. Why? Because they're overstimulated by technology too early in life while the brain's still developing, which is till at least age 25. And we see more depression, more anxiety, more ADD, ADHD, all kinds of things because we're not pacing ourselves with technology. Now, there are many wonderful things that help us stay connected. On the other hand, what I hear from pastors is, well, now I can get a passive-aggressive text or email or Facebook post from somebody any time of day or night, and I'm trying to relax and watch the Astros win. Yeah, anyone? Okay. I thought there'd be a bigger reaction to that. Oh, well. Or watch the Dodgers win. No? Okay. That's not good. Okay. And somebody posts something on Facebook that creates a false reality about the church in some way, and you got to deal with that because it takes on a whole life of its own. And have you noticed how people will behave in social media in ways they would never behave face to face? And it's just not real helpful, is it? Especially in the polarized, kind of politically polarized era in kind of which we're living. And so it's dehumanizing. People aren't treating one another like whole people. And it's just enormously challenging. And then rapid external change. There are folks writing about the fact that we're in an era of discontinuous change, meaning it's very difficult to predict what's out ahead based on what's come before. And so there's a constant adaptation required. And you all have lived this, especially through COVID. Almost overnight, everything pastors do had to be done differently. Literally almost overnight. How do you do pastoral care for people in the hospital from a distance? How do you learn to preach to an iPhone instead of to a sanctuary full of people? Radical adaptation. And then it's just as soon as you think you got it dialed in, oh, they're opening back up for in-person, masks, no masks, big controversy. Then it shuts down again, so you got to adapt and then readapt and then readapt again. And just when we think we've got it dialed in, 3 other variables change and we got to adapt again. And there's a need for adaptive leadership. But what that requires of a person is a lot. And so we need to pay attention to ourselves and how we're doing with that, because no matter who you are, that's going to be taxing emotionally. I was talking with a couple of you over the break, and the name Dr. Archibald Hart came up. He is a dear friend and mentor to me in grad school and beyond. He was one of the first psychologists really to ever study ministry burnout and stress, starting in the 70s and 80s, was decades ahead of his time really in his thinking and research. And this is my all-time favorite quote from Arch Hart, that pastors don't get into difficulty because we forget that we're pastors. That's not the issue. We get into difficulty because we forget that we're persons. You're a person. You're a human being, and I want to give you permission to give yourself permission to be human. And all the implications that come with that, with the limitations, the vulnerabilities, and the gifts that come with that. And give yourself permission to be a person. Have you noticed other people have expectations of you? Yeah? 1 or 2 people in your church have that? One of my favorite authors about clergy stress talks about what he calls presumptive expectations. People presume to know better than you do how to do your job. And it's their mission, spiritual gift to tell you that and tell everybody else that, right? And in that's difficult enough to deal with, but you know whose expectations are the most difficult to deal with for pastors? Yeah, our own. If you can, we want to do right by our calling, have high expectations for ourselves, and rightly so, but are they fair expectations? Are you cultivating a sense of self-acceptance? It's amazing how much power the criticism from other people goes away. It doesn't go away completely, but a lot of it goes away when we have kind of adjusted fair expectations of ourselves. I'll give you a quick story of what I mean by that. When I was a young pastor, just new on a pastoral staff in Southern California. I was still in seminary at the time, in my mid-20s. And I grew up in the church, but this is the first time I'm actually in an official pastoral role. And we had this amazing worship service. It was a large church like this one. And just incredible worship service. And right after church, I'm talking with the executive pastor, who's still a dear friend and mentor in my life, and love this man. And right after this amazing worship service, I mean, it was like one of those that you, beyond what you pray for as a pastor kind of a thing. And this little old lady who, as they say, came with the building, she'd been there forever, came up and just started to chew him out about some stuff. And I'm like, were you not just in the same service we were in? Like, what in the world? And I'm starting to feel ticked off, honestly. I mean, I feel myself like reacting. I look over at my friend and mentor, and he's just standing there calmly, not anxious. And she kept going, and then she tapered off, and he said, is there more? And there was, and so she started going into some more. And I'm like ready to tangle with this lady. I'm like, let's do this. You want to fight? Let's go. And he said to her, I can tell by how passionate you are about your comments that you love this church deeply. And I want you to know we have that in common. So I want to thank you for caring enough to express some concerns. And I'm aware that several of the things you're talking about, you are absolutely right. I am not good at those things. I wish I was too, but I'm not. That's why we have Pastor Chris here and these other staff to emphasize those things, because they are gifted in those things. And and here's where I'm accountable to growing in those areas. I'd like for you to pray for me that I'll continue to grow. She didn't know what to do with that. Totally disarmed her, right? And then he said, and in addition to that, I need to ask you to never speak to me that way again, because that was unkind and hurtful. And she said to him, why won't you fight with me? And he said, I'm just not going to do that, but I'd like you to help you understand why you want me to do that. And that became a pastoral counseling conversation that ended with a referral to therapy and I think medication in that case, which was good. As one of my senior adult seminary students said once in class, sometimes people need Jesus and a pill, is what she said. So that was the case for this person. Masterfully handled. Then we went to lunch and he was fine. I'm like still fuming over this, like over lunch. I'm still mad. But he had done years of therapy, he was self-aware. He's like, yeah, you're right. I'm not good at that. So he was free. He had changed his expectations of himself over time, and then was able to lovingly hand her back her expectations and say, I'm not going to carry those. And we'll talk more about the importance of that. Give yourself permission to be a person. So what do we know about the impact of stress on pastors? As a group of people, if you look at us as a group, there are some significant concerns. One of which is what's called metabolic syndrome. We are at higher risk for metabolic syndrome than most of the population of North America. What is metabolic syndrome? If you have 3 of these 5 things, and our parish nurse here could probably explain this better than I can. Are you familiar with this term, metabolic syndrome? Yeah. If you have high blood pressure, high bad cholesterol, which is the triglycerides, low good cholesterol, which is called HDL, it's supposed to be at a certain level or higher to be healthy, and that's actually the bigger risk factor for heart attack than high triglycerides, is my understanding. High blood sugar, which is, of course, connected to what disease process? Anybody? Diabetes. And a large abdominal circumference, meaning moving into clinical obesity, the way a physician would diagnose that. You have metabolic syndrome. Well, why does that matter? It matters because metabolic syndrome is the only thing health insurance companies have figured out is the thing that makes you high risk to cover next year. Well, why is that? Well, because if you have 3 of these 5 things, you're at exponentially higher risk for cardiovascular disease, heart attack, stroke, diabetes, arthritis, kidney disease, lung disease, bunch of bad stuff that could cut short your capacity to be engaged in effective ministry. My grandfather, Nazarene pastor, died in his early 60s of a heart attack, and I'm convinced it was ministry stress related. He did everything at the churches where he worked. He mowed the church yard. He ran off the church bulletins on a mimeograph machine back in those days and had to fix it when it broke. He preached. He led worship. He did it all. And it took a toll. Because nobody was talking about this back in those years. Why do we think this? Does this surprise anybody, by the way? No? I was sharing with the group yesterday. I don't know how many of you went to General Assembly, but I was at General Assembly for a couple days and had the privilege of doing a workshop there. And it just occurred to me, looking at our Nazarene family all together, it was like a metabolic syndrome convention. Right? I mean, is it okay for me to say that amongst brothers and sisters? What's that about? Well, what we think is happening for pastors is because of the role immersion, the 24/7 nature of the role, we are constantly overtaxing our stress hormones to meet the demands of the job. There are 37 plus stress hormones that get released in the body and brain when we face challenge or threat or stress. Adrenaline is a big one. Ministry is a very adrenaline demanding profession. Don't know if you've thought about that, but it is. Even the highs of ministry, preaching, leading worship. I have a friend who he's an athlete, college athlete. He wears his Fitbit when he preaches. And he said his stats look the same after a sermon as they do after he's worked out in terms of his heart rate. And it's very adrenaline demanding, which is why many pastors experience the Monday blues. Anybody ever experienced this where you wake up on Monday, you're kind of foggy-headed, maybe a little more irritable than normal, just kind of draggy, and a lot of people take Monday off for that reason. I want to make a suggestion to you that you not do that for this reason. What you are experiencing is a post-adrenaline, transient, mild depression. Your physiology, your stress physiology is trying to recover from Sunday when you cranked out all these stress hormones for 4, 6, 8, 12 hours or however long that day was. Your body's trying to recover. So my reasoning is this: if the church created most of your stress, then they can have you on the day when you're not 100%. I think it's a fair trade-off, right? Take a day off later in the week when you actually feel good enough to engage with things that are restorative to you, and try that for a couple of months. You might be surprised the difference that makes. But that's one of the kinds of things that can happen. Our stress response system is a gift, but it was meant to be short-lived. So the idea is that we have the fight or flight or freeze response you may have heard about, that the challenge or threat or stress comes and we go into stress response mode. Our brain tells our body to send resources to our vital organs. A very small example of this is if you've ever been nervous before a sermon or a board meeting or district assembly or something and your hands get cold. That's a very mild example of what I'm talking about. Your brain is telling your body, take resources away from your extremities, send them to your heart, to your key organs. That's our stress response system, but it's meant to be short-lived, where the threat or challenge passes, and then our stress physiology goes way back down to baseline rest. But here's the challenge for pastors. Unless we're really intentional about it, it never comes all the way back down to baseline rest. It gets elevated on Sunday, maybe Monday morning it starts to come down, and then, oops, somebody is in the hospital I got to go see, and then it starts coming down. Wednesday night's coming, Thursday night board meeting, it goes way up, and then it comes back down. And so it never comes all the way back down for a sustained period of time. So we are over-arousing our stress physiology chronically. And then you combine that with a lack of exercise. The average pastor in North America, several studies say, exercises once a month. Is that going to be enough? Probably not. We all need to get 7 to 9 hours of good sleep a night, is what the experts tell us. If you don't get that, you develop a sleep debt that can actually lead to cognitive impairment and all kinds of other health issues if we are sleep deprived. And paying attention to healthy nutrition. Grew up in the South. The Nashville First Church potlucks are like epic in my memory. Almost everything was fried twice. I mean, it was amazing food. Nobody, I don't think, was really thinking about what are we doing to our pastor's arteries, because everybody wants the pastor to eat their casserole, and somehow it validates them if that happens. A lot of church culture is around food, and that's a wonderful thing. It's around food. But if you combine the lack of some very basic things, sleep, exercise, and nutrition that's healthy, combine that with this chronically elevated stress physiology, you get metabolic syndrome and depression and burnout, by the way. So let me pause there for a second. Questions, comments about that? Let me tell you also something that I wonder about. In my experience, pastors are more susceptible to what we call process addictions than sort of the classic addictions like substance abuse, alcohol, cocaine, whatever, with the exception of opioids, by the way. So among clergy, there is a concerning rise in opioid addiction that happens by accident. I have surgery, I get prescribed a painkiller, and get hooked. Most pastors, though, crack addiction, alcoholism is more taboo. But it's possible to become engrossed in what's called a process addiction, being addicted to the brain's own internal chemical processes the same way that you can a substance. This is how sexual addiction works. Pornography is an epidemic among clergy, which is concerning, of course. Both men and women. With women, it tends to be more illicit chat room kinds of things that are more relational in nature. With men, it's more visual stimulation with pornographic images and so forth. And it's not the sexual arousal, it's not the pornography per se that we get addicted to. It's the dopamine and adrenaline and a bunch of other stuff that we get in our brain. That is what we become addicted to. Workaholism works this way too. That's the tough one for us. We get adrenaline from our work. And so if we're not careful, our workaholism is actually a form of a process addiction that's out of balance with the kind of life that God would have for us. Our smartphones. Again, every time you get a text, an Instagram hit, an email on your phone, you get a little mini hit of dopamine and some other stuff in your brain, times the 250 times a day the average person checks their phone, and it becomes an addictive chemical process. We're going to start seeing, I'm convinced, treatment centers springing up for technology addiction. They have them in other parts of the world. You ever been on vacation and tried to unplug? I'll confess to you, several years ago, I just said, okay, I'm going to totally unplug on vacation. I'm not going to look at my email. I'm not going to answer my phone. I'm going to let everybody know, don't bother me unless it's an emergency, and even if it is, call this person first, kind of a thing. And for the first 3 or 4 days, I was fighting the urge to check my phone. Anybody ever experienced that? It's like, wow, this thing has me. I knew logically I didn't need to, but there was kind of this compulsion to, because of what happens in our brain and body and our physiology around that kind of thing. Food addiction also works this way. Nothing wrong with having a wonderful meal. Had some great food while I've been in Texas. You guys have a lot of great food here. And there's nothing wrong with that, enjoying that, celebrating that. But if we're not careful, the dopamine and other chemicals we get, serotonin that we get in our brain when we have that really amazing meal, we can start to self-medicate our pain emotionally with food. And I wonder about that across our tribe as a concern. Heard a lot of great sermons growing up on the challenges of alcohol, and rightly so. I mean, nothing really good comes from alcohol abuse. I don't ever remember hearing a sermon on overeating. Maybe because it was in the South, I don't know. But there's something to this that, especially as clergy, we need to pay attention to if we're going to steward our health well over the length of a lifetime and career. These are some Nazarene-specific statistics just to emphasize this is an issue for us, which I think you know. 22% of our, about 1,000 Nazarene pastors from North America, so about a fifth said they reported little or no satisfaction with their current physical health. 32%, a third, reported little or no physical energy. And 11% said their physical health is a point where it actually is impairing them in their work. And so this is something we need to pay attention to. We also know that that one of the things that chronic stress does is it suppresses neurotransmitters in the brain that are associated with depression and anxiety. So under chronic stress, our brain stops making as much serotonin and other neurotransmitters. If those get too low for too long, people start to exhibit symptoms of depression and anxiety. There are also other reasons why depression is very common among clergy. I heard a psychiatrist not too long ago speaking to a group of pastors say, psychiatrists are actually more familiar with clergy and their offices than most clergy realize. And he called being a pastor the equivalent of living in a serotonin-depleting environment. Isn't that interesting? There's something about just the nature of the role and the experience, the chronic stress of which depletes us from the levels of brain chemicals that are healthy. Now, there are other reasons for depression in ministry. Certainly, any number of losses that you are exposed to, directly or indirectly. You're helping people through grief, death, and dying, through divorce, through all kinds of losses, and there can be a weight to that. That again, if we're not paying attention to what's accumulating outside of our awareness, then that can impact us and lead to depression. The reason I share this is I want to normalize depression for you in pastoral ministry. You can read the journals of Wesley, Charles Spurgeon. Anybody know that name? Great holiness preacher. Read Charles Spurgeon's journals. Straight up hardcore clinical depression he's writing about. Wasn't using those words because it was in a scientific era, so to speak, but read church history. Read scripture. Most any iconic pastor that you probably know in your life, if you really sat them down and asked them about the span of their career, they would probably say, I've been through at least one or more mild to moderate seasons of feeling depressed, largely induced by the stress of ministry. It just comes with the territory to some extent. Now, we all have vulnerabilities that we bring into this as well, genetically, psychologically, that for some of us, we're more vulnerable than others. Why do I say that? Because it's so often the case in my experience where a pastor will say to me, it's a therapy client or coaching client, you've probably never heard a pastor talk about feeling this depressed, but here it is. And I just kind of smile and say, actually, no, it's very common. And there's some kind of internal narrative that happens because of our expectations for ourselves, where the internal dialogue is something like this. I shouldn't be feeling this way because I'm a pastor. I have a degree from Southern Nazarene University and Nazarene Theological Seminary, perhaps, or Bible College. I've been doing this for 25 years. I should not be feeling depressed. This means I'm a failure as a spiritual leader and a disciple. And we can start beating ourselves up internally, even engaged in self-abuse emotionally, for being depressed, which just does what to the depression? Makes it worse. Certainly doesn't help. As opposed to responding the way you respond to everybody else in your life. One of my favorite questions, and I told this to the group yesterday, that I love to ask pastors I'm working with, What would you say to you right now if you came to you for pastoral counseling? We forget to put ourselves on our pastoral care list and extend the same self-compassion, gentleness, approach it holistically, as Jeffrey was talking about. It's always the best approach with depression and anxiety. And give yourself permission to be human. If you find yourself in a season of depression as a pastor, it just means you're human. That's what it means. And it's there to listen to and understand and address. And God has ways of bringing healing and redemption out of that. We are finding too, by the way, there's a gender difference in depression. The way we've historically diagnosed depression is maybe more a female experience of depression. Generally speaking, we have to be careful not to overgeneralize, of course. But women often tend to be more subjectively aware of feeling depressed. Men, depending on how we're raised, what culture or subculture you grew up in, can be socialized to not be in touch with our feelings. Men are tough, boys don't cry, and the message is cut yourself off from your inner emotional life. So it's very possible for a male pastor to be depressed and not actually be subjectively aware of it, but there's addictive behavior happening, anger issues, it's coming out behaviorally. Kind of like if those of you that have done children's ministry, if you watch little girls and little boys more often will act stuff out in their behavior. Big boys are the same way. And so we want to think about this for ourselves and again, normalize it. Okay, so what can we do about this? And there are some things we can do, thankfully, to help ourselves. It does not have to be this way. So my intention this morning is not to depress you about your chosen profession and calling. It's to say to you, these stats don't have to look like this. There's a lot we can do. And so let me tell you about some of the things that we're learning seem to be the things that healthy, flourishing pastors are practicing. The first area here is contemplative spiritual practices. And if you're not familiar with that term, things like Christian meditation, scripture memorization, different kinds of prayer, silence, solitude, centering prayer, breath prayer, praying in images, those kinds of things. Now we're still learning why do we think these are so helpful. It's not that other spiritual practices are unimportant. It's that these seem to be especially important for pastors. We think in part because in these kinds of practices, you're just being with God, just communing with God, just listening to God, receiving from God. You don't have to sort of do anything as in a religious performance kind of way as part of the practice, which is what you have to do all the time, right? I don't know how many of you work with young clergy or seminary students, but it's always around like second year of seminary students will say, why do I get asked to pray at every family gathering now? Because I'm in seminary. Like nobody else can pray all of a sudden, you know. So religiously perform, go, go, go. And to step outside of that and be a beloved son of God, beloved daughter of God, and just be in the presence of God is a very important practice. Practicing Sabbath in the full sense of that word. Not everybody can take a literal 24-hour Sabbath, but there's a principle there that's very important. It's not just about refraining from work. It's about engaging with things that are restorative, that are recreative, recreational, that are renewing. Relationships that breathe life into you, other kinds of activities that are going to be restorative is an important practice. Taking care of our bodies, we talked about that. If you find yourself struggling with your physical health, the first thing to triage is your sleep. There's so much research coming out now about the importance of good sleep. We're learning more about what happens in our body and brain while we sleep. There's more help and treatment than ever in getting good sleep. So get a sleep study done, make sure you're getting good sleep. That's always the place to start. It's amazing what a good night's sleep can do for us, right? Especially if we can get that on a regular basis. Embracing our limits. We have limits, as it turns out. And sometimes we push those or fight against those. instead of embracing those and working with those and being honest with ourselves about those. We have more conscious choice over our adrenaline expenditure than we think that we do. I can take a step back from a situation and do what psychologists call a cognitive appraisal. I can look at what's the nature of the situation, what is at stake for me in this, what's getting triggered in me, and why, and then decide how do I then respond, as opposed to sort of knee-jerk reacting to it. Because what can happen, given the frequent nature of crises and unpredictable stuff and all the demands that are just unrelenting for pastors, is we can start responding to everything indiscriminately as if it's a 5-alarm fire. And we're over-expending adrenaline when we don't really have to. It might be a 5-alarm fire, in which case, you let yourself go into full crisis response mode and then take time to recover afterward. But it might only be a 1-alarm fire, in which case you only go into 1-alarm fire mode. We had a phrase when I was a university chaplain called worst pain, what did we call it? I'm going to get it wrong. Yeah, worst pain crisis. Students would come in to the office and sometimes be in crisis. I'm suicidal. I've just found out on the phone my dad was killed in a car accident. I was sexually assaulted at a party last night. Those are crises. While painful, your first B+ on a test of your life is maybe your worst pain you've been in, but not a crisis the way we define a crisis. Now, that doesn't mean we minimize it and don't care, but I'm going to go into a different response mode for the suicidal student versus the student who got their first B+. Make sense? You determine that in your appraisal and what you will allow yourself to go into. And just taking a few moments to think that through actually will lower your blood pressure over time, lower your cholesterol over time, because you're deciding, I may not even need to respond to this at all, even if somebody in the church thinks that I do. You decide that. It's a lot of the leadership in ministry, the literature talks about being a non-anxious presence in the midst of an anxious group of people. And I like to talk about being the least anxious presence. I don't know that it's possible to be totally non-anxious. But anxiety is kind of contagious. Have you noticed that? If people are urgent and anxious, then it's easy to take that on. You don't have to take that on. You can help them with that without getting sucked into it in different ways and regulate how much adrenaline you're going to expend. Make sense? So here's what I want you to do. Yeah.
Does this relate to the Moses burning bush?
Yeah. So I'll mention that too. Yeah. So thank you for reminding me, Jeffrey. I mentioned yesterday, heard a great sermon from a Nazarene DS of all things. Who knew, that would be the case? I'm just teasing. Who had done some exegetical homework around the Call of Moses story, the story of the burning bush. And I had never heard this before, so I actually went and researched it afterward to make sure he wasn't just making this up or something. Not that I would think a DS would do that, but just double checking. There is a kind of bush in the desert where Moses would have been wandering that even to this day will spontaneously combust if it gets hot enough in the desert. It'll just poof, burst into flame if it gets hot. It's 130 degrees or something in the desert. So it may not have been unusual for Moses to see that kind of bush on fire. What was unusual was that it wasn't being consumed and it was speaking to him. So the task of ministry then is to learn which fires to pay attention to. Isn't that good? There's a discernment skill here that can help us manage our adrenaline and other stress physiology that is what is so taxing. And this is often totally off the radar for pastors. They don't realize they're doing this to themselves because it's not intentional. But how are we pacing ourselves with this? So what I want to do is have you talk about your stress. Stress tends to show up and impact us where we're most vulnerable, physically, emotionally, relationally, spiritually. Where does stress show up for you? How do you know when you're stressed? There's a spot in the middle of my back my wife calls the Chris spot, because if I get stressed and I haven't really paid attention to it, it will knot up in the same spot every single time. And it's like, oh, I guess I am stressed. I need to think about what am I carrying? We carry stress in our bodies often. How would you know when you're stressed? How do other people know when you're stressed? Where's that showing up? And what's one practice you can think about that you might adopt to help to manage that well? Again, we're not going to eliminate stress. That's not even the goal. We just want to manage it. And how can you address your own daily well-being and a rhythm of a practice or two that you want to take up in the near future to help promote your well-being and flourishing? Make sense? All right, go for it. I'll give you about 15, 20 minutes to talk about this at your tables.